This is the lecture series, The ABCs of Communism. My name is Jason Smith. The textbook for this series is available to those of you who may not have it in your hands from Kindle books, Amazon.com in ebook form, and is entitled ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2014. This book's been coming out every year for the last 10 years, so it's now in its 10th edition. If you decide to get it in ebook form, you'll want to type in 2014 so you get the right edition. At any rate, our subject matter is going to start today with the general crisis of capitalism, and I want to give you a little bit of historical background on that. First of all, when Karl Marx died in 1883, the author of Capital, the classic book which unlocked the secrets of capitalist production, at his funeral, his longtime collaborator and friend Friedrich Engels explained to the audience that in his view, the two most important contributions that Karl Marx had made to science were discovering the laws of history and unlocking the secrets of capitalist production. In this lecture series, we'll go through both of those. We'll begin with the unlocking of the secrets of capitalist production because that's where Karl Marx started. What he had available to him, what he worked on almost all of his life, in one library or another in Europe, was a tremendous amount of data that was available at the time about capitalist production. Now, the important thing, next important thing I want you to remember here is that for years Marx worked on, that is from 1842 until the beginning of the American Civil War in 1861, a long period of time. He spent a great deal of time on the history of the theory of surplus value. During the course of the American Civil War, he decided to discard that entire approach. He decided to begin capital in an entirely new way. Those of you familiar with the book will know that Chapter 1 is entitled The Commodity. What happened to all those years of research? Well, they didn't even see the light of day until long after Marx had died. We'll talk about that later. I thought also about starting this lecture series in a different way, actually in much the same way as the book unfolds, dealing with the most primitive ape-like societies, going through three banned stages: the agricultural revolution, that is the period we call primitive communism, the transition to class and state society through periods of chiefdoms. And I realized that if I do that, I'll have my audience sound asleep long before we get to the key points. So what we're going to do is duplicate what Marx did. We're going to start the same way he did, by unlocking the secrets of capitalist production. All I have to do is explain to you what he was doing. This chart that you see over here at the top is a key that I want you to remember. What I've done is to boil down hundreds of pages of the beginning of Capital in such a way that you can think of it in formulaic terms. Marx himself was quite fond of using mathematical formulas to explain economic concepts. So that will not be new to him, but it is perhaps a new way of explaining it to people that are just learning about economics for the first time. Take a look at the category here called LP. On this formula you see over here, you're going to see the LP. What is LP? Labor power. That doesn't mean concrete labor such as you might be performing if you were making a pot or painting a picture or doing something of an artisanal nature in this day and age. That's what we call concrete labor. What Karl Marx invented was an entirely new category. It's the only new category he invented and added to classical economics. That category is based on the idea that you have a group of men working at a factory bench who produce so many things per unit time. That unit time is governed by the factory clock. Now, that doesn't matter whether there's 20 men working at a factory bench or 200 or 2,000. Some will be faster at what they're doing than others, but in the end it's homogenized. The average product that you get per unit time is what we call the average product of labor power. Now the next thing there is the letter T, which stands for technology. In capitalist times, we have machinofacture as the basic kind of technology. There are 5 essential elements to that. We'll talk about that later in its earliest form. Today we have automated and cyberneticized machinofacture. Those two things together produce value in 2 different forms. What we call V1, which is value that is paid to the laborer in the form of wages. That is theoretically what's required to maintain him alive and those people he's responsible for. V2 is that value which is created, which pays for the maintenance of the technology itself to keep it in optimal condition. Now, in capitalist production with machinofacture, we have something that's quite different, and that's the production of huge quantities of surplus value. Now, surplus value in this sense is one other thing. We have the concepts within the commodity, not only exchange value and use value. That is, use, the value that an object may have, a commodity has for somebody, has a utilitarian value for that person. It has an exchange value, which was what the capitalist is really interested in, because that's where he's going to make his money. Now, in addition to exchange value and use value, we have surplus value and value. Now, these 2 kinds of value we just talked about. But everything else that the worker produces at the factory bench, which is not paid to him or used to maintain the machinery, in this formula is considered surplus value. Surplus value is the source of the capitalist's legal profit making. Let's go back for just a moment and contrast mercantile capitalism with capitalism of the pure sense. The germinal of pure capitalism existed thousands of years ago, even in the primitive city-states of Mesopotamia, that is Iraq, and Egypt. But that was just a germinal. We say that was a germinal of capitalist production because we had workers at factory benches making pottery, for example, and their unit time was regulated by some kind of clock. But the important thing you want to be thinking about right here is that with machinofacture we have an explosion in the amount of value and surplus value being created. Now, in the capitalist system, the big source of the problem is the conflict which exists between the subcolumn over here of profit and the subcolumn of the next generation of machinery. This is a problem because in order for the capitalist to compete, he has to he lives in a dog-eat-dog world. He has lots of competitors. In order to survive in that world, he has to produce the same good, or perhaps a better form of commodity, at a cheaper price than his competitors. To do that, he needs to constantly invest in a new generation of machinery. Now, the advantage to that is that by investing in a new generation of machinery, he can hire less workers or work his existing workforce fewer hours and thereby pay less money. That's why there's a constant struggle among capitalists to see who's going to survive. Some will not go for this route. They'll just say, no, I'm not going to do that. It's going to cost me too much money. It isn't worth it, one reason or another. They fall by the wayside. The sharks eat the sardines. Big capitalists get bigger. Small capitalists get eaten and discarded. Or they retire and forget about the whole thing and let Bobby and Susie make their own way in the world. One way or the other, however, that is a contradiction which has to be resolved. One of the results of this is what's called the absolute decline in the rate of profit. Now, in order to maintain the same rate of profit over here on the far right side of the equation as you're looking at it, you would have to increase the amount of labor power per unit to the equivalent amount of technological increase in productive potential. But that's not what the capitalist does. He can't do that. That's not what he started out getting new machinery for. He got new machinery so he could make the same product, maybe a better product, cheaper. And he does that by hiring fewer workers to run that machinery. In the United States today, we are suffering another depression as a consequence of this absolute decline in the rate of profit. As the worker becomes more efficient, he's replaced in large numbers, sent to the street, unemployed. His productive capability is much greater because of the machinery. So while American production increases in terms of its productivity ratio on an annual basis by substantial amounts, the consequent effect of is more and more workers being unemployed. This has always been the case, and this is called the iron law of capitalist relations. This is the reason Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels discovered this is the answer to the question Professor Hegel answered in the early 1800s, and that was, why is it that every labor-saving device created by man that should be making life better for workers, in fact finds workers using them worse off than they were before? And the reason is the capitalist system of economic relations requires this absolute decline in the rate of profit. Again, the only way you can maintain the same rate is by introducing productive labor at the same rate as you're introducing the productive power of the new technology, and that's exactly the opposite of what the capitalist can do and wants to do. Now, there are 18 pages devoted to this subject in your textbook under the chapter 12 on capitalism. And I'll let you go ahead and pursue that. I want to make a couple of other points first, if I may. So within the commodity, we have exchange value and we have use value. We have regular value that pays the worker and repairs the machinery, and surplus value, which is above and beyond all of that. Now, even though the capitalist has the world as his marketplace, and this is an essential part of Marxist economics, even though it's never existed, it doesn't exist today, because there's always some kinds of tariffs or protectionists being put into place by one group of capitalists to protect themselves against another group of capitalists. In theory, in the ideal circumstances, the entire world is the marketplace, and even though he has that, the people don't eat iron, for example. So an iron manufacturer has to sell his iron to somebody that would make something out of it, perhaps steel. A steel manufacturer has to sell his product to another capitalist to make something out of that. By the time it gets to the end user, we're way down the line. Now that is the way to absorb a great deal of that surplus value, and that's another reason why capitalism expands its industrial plant, buildings, roads, and so on so quickly, because something has to absorb all of that surplus value. So in addition to exchange value and use value, value and surplus value, we have another thing within the commodity, and that's paid labor versus unpaid labor. Now, the amount of money that's being paid out to the workers is rather small compared to the total amount of value that's being created. Unpaid labor is what surplus value is. In other words, the capitalist legally appropriates the value of the workers in the productive process by stealing it from them and not paying them for that part of it, and appropriating that part to himself, which is why Marx and Engels and classical economists and agitators to this very day point out that capitalism is a legalized form of theft. What differentiated that form of theft from the earlier form of swindling, mercantile capitalism, was fairly simple. In mercantile capitalist times, a capitalist might, for example, own a boat in England or Holland, somewhere like that. He would buy some kinds of trade goods that he thought he could sell in the Far East. Now, sometimes that worked out pretty well, sometimes it didn't. The first Britishers to arrive in Calicut, that is what's now called Bombay or Mumbai, were almost hung by the Indians because they knew the value of the glass beads that the British were bringing them, and it wasn't very great at all, and they didn't want that kind of junk. But generally speaking, the Britishers had at least at first been able to pass off glass beads in exchange for things that had real value back home. And of course the people of Indonesia, the so-called Spice Islands, they had no idea of what any of this stuff was worth in Europe. They weren't even sure where Europe was or if it even existed. when a mercantile capitalist knows the value of things on both ends, then he can essentially swindle both sides of the operation and he can make himself very wealthy. That's what the early phases of capitalism were like in the feudal stage. We'll talk about that, these stages later on. But my point is, with the invention of machinery, with machinofacture, putting workers at the factory bench, the entire method of capital accumulation changed for the first time in the history of the world. Now, a capitalist could simply pay a worker whatever he could get away with, and everything else that that worker made, he appropriated for himself, and that was legal. That was a legal form, as opposed to a swindling form of capitalism, and that was the basis upon which all of this has developed since that time. Now, we covered the absolute decline in the rate of surplus value production, and we have talked about some of the aspects of what's within every commodity. Now, one other thing we want to get to at this point is the idea of socially necessary labor time. Now, in order for, this is what you'll hear the phrase in economics classes, at least in some universities, the law of value. The law of value refers to the bottom line is how much socially necessary labor time is involved in the production of any given commodity. Now, that is what we call value one, value two. That's the socially necessary labor time that's involved. Now, when we take a look at the history of capitalist production, there are a few other things that you're going to want to take a look at. Let's begin with what were the 5 essential factors for machinofacture to begin with. Well, one was an independent source of power, that is, independent of human power. Wind, water, steam engines. The steam engine was the most important, which was the critical one right there. The next was a plentiful supply of cheap iron, pig iron, which meant blast furnaces. The third was a machine tools that could cut iron. Fourth was a factory installation of all of this material, and that was, when you put these different features together, you have the basic elements of machinofacture. Each one of these was not invented in Europe first, interestingly. Each one of these was actually invented in China first. So you would say, well, why isn't the capitalism emerged first in China? Why did it have to be brought to China by a bunch of privateers and opium traders? Well, the reason was fairly simple when you stop and take a look at it. The Chinese imperial system, which had been a slave-based system until 221 BC, and which then became a feudal system for the next 2,000 years, was based on the idea of exploiting peasant labor in the agricultural fields. And they did this extremely efficiently. That's where wealth was made, and that's where the Chinese ruling class was sitting on top of a permanent system. They used 250,000 scholar bureaucrats who were, by the way, castrated at a fairly early age, and they're called eunuch scholars in the Chinese system. The idea was that if they could not reproduce, they couldn't steal. The Chinese rulers knew that all bureaucrats steal, one amount or another. They did then, they still do. Nothing new about that. The idea was they would not be able to pass on their ill-gotten wealth to subsequent generations. Now, in practice, these eunuchs managed to pass on their ill-gotten wealth to nieces and nephews and all kinds of relatives and friends, and it didn't stop their drive for corruption, but there at least was an attempt to do it that way. And that lasted for a couple thousand years. At any rate, in the West, where capitalism as we know it first emerged, the machinofacture people of Northern Europe and England and the northern part of the continent had none of this feudal overburden of the same strength. There were, of course, feudal classes living off of peasant labor, slave labor in the extreme cases of Russia and Eastern Europe, or serf labor of relatively higher degree of freedom in England and France, especially England. where the crossbow gave the average farmer a certain oh yeah feeling that a person might get today if he had a pistol in his hip pocket and somebody was trying to bully him. At any rate, these people had far less of a feudal control over them. So socially they were able to establish themselves and maintain themselves. They could maintain a certain amount of armed force in their own hands. And when they had machinifacture, when they got these things together in one place, there was no stopping them. Now, the blast furnaces weren't invented in Europe until 1500, but they had been invented 2,000 years earlier in China. That's an example of the difference. But in Europe, they did not have the overburden sitting on top of them that the bourgeoisie, that is the French word for middle class, meaning between the peasants and the aristocrats, they didn't have that. So they were able to move much more quickly. Another example is the steam engine. First steam engines were invented long before they were used in England, in China. In fact, it was a French priest that brought one back as a toy to France, and then it was quickly copied in France and then by Mr. Watt in England, and became a really important centerpiece for English industrialization. The point is that there was nobody to stop these things from happening in Europe. Nobody sitting on top of them that would stop somebody from employing a steam engine or a blast furnace. In fact, they had more work than they could account for. At any rate, that's the reason capitalism emerges first in the most backward part of what had been the most backward part of Eurasia, which was Europe. Now I have another chart up here. I want to skip for a moment to the beginning of the servitude epoch. There are three stages in the servitude epoch: slavery, feudalism, and capitalism. Now we started with capitalism, the most recent end, because that's where Karl Marx started. Another reason is that it makes it easier for you to understand as we project this formulaic structure back in time. Now, I want you to notice four things on this particular chart. When we had the chart of capitalism up there, we had all of these same things, and then underneath there we had A, B, C, and D. Why is that? Well, A is labor power, B is technology, C is value, and D is surplus value. You can think of these as the mathematical equivalents of the nucleotides within DNA. Now, there's no such thing as sociocultural DNA, but in mathematics we can think of it that way. We can project all four of these elements back in time to our earliest ape-like days, and we will before this series is over. But we don't have to go very far back to take a look at the general crisis of slavery. As I pointed out, the general crisis of capitalism is created by the friction between the capitalist's desire for profit and the necessity the capitalist faces of investing in a new generation of machinery. That new generation of machinery cuts down on the amount of money he has in the way of profit. He may want to do many things with his money, but those are the two different columns that he has to consider to be the most important, and that we have to consider therefore as the most important in our formulaic analysis. Well, what was it like during the slave days? Slavery is the first stage of the servitude epoch. It's the beginning of what we call civilization. It's the period in which class and state society first emerge. It is simply the army and police. You don't need all of these long diatribes and discussions by intellectuals about the state here, the state there. That's all nonsense. What the state is armed force in the hands of a ruling class. Army and police, in other words. In archaeology, we can cut to the chase, because when we're looking for proof of the evidence of the state, we're looking for weapons, for barracks squares, training grounds, fortresses, places where soldiers live, where they work, their workshops, and that sort of thing. That's all the state is. Now, the key question is, when did the state come into existence as far as slavery is concerned? Because you can't keep people as slaves if you don't have a way. You have to do it by force. They're not willingly going to submit to slavery. So, one of the key questions that faced anthropology from its earliest days was how to resolve this question. Well, Marx and Engels actually resolved it when they established the formula, when they defined the nature of the state. Friedrich Engels said the state is the product of the irreconcilability of class antagonisms. What does that mean? Well, classes have to exist, and they have to have antagonistic relationships which are irreconcilable except with the fist, with the club, with fire, with force. So in societies where the state emerged, meaning where some group of people, for whatever reason, and there are archaeologically, we know of many different ways by which classes can be separated. First of all, they had to have the mental desire to separate, and that's something that we'll get to when we talk about transition from primitive communism through the chiefdoms. It's something that Karl Marx found, first of all, in his notebooks, which are now published as the Ethnological Notebooks of Karl Marx. In 1972, an English translation of them was presented by a man named Lawrence Crater. That book is in most university libraries. If you read it, or read the introductory 70-odd pages that Mr. Crater wrote, you'll see that Marx found for his satisfaction that the beginning of class division occurs within the chiefdoms. He was right about that, and that was one of the major topics of my life of research. Before we get to that, though, we need to talk about what the first stage of civilization looked like. That is, what did slavery look like? Well, we have the state apparatus in the hands of ruling families. The state apparatus means armed men who are on the full-time payroll of your group. Now, that is also the source of the general crisis of slavery. The cost of the state escalates through time. And as it does, it cuts into the amount of money you have available for profit. Eventually, the cost of the state becomes so overwhelming that it's not worth it. Thus we have the collapse of the Roman Empire. You don't need all of Mr. Gibbon's talk and books to understand that the collapse of the Roman Empire occurred for any other reason. Gibbon, as I recall, decided that it was the corruption of Roman society, by which he meant the moral corruption of Roman society, which brought about its downfall. But that won't hold water. And besides that, the important thing was that the cost of maintaining the legions all the way from Hadrian's Wall in England through France and all across the Mediterranean, all across North Africa, had become enormous. It was absorbing virtually all of the money that the patrician families would have taken, and had been taking for centuries, as profit. So all of a sudden, the value of the state to them began to change. Many of them simply moved to Constantinople, or what's now Istanbul, and decided to start over again over there in a better spot. However, the important thing is we know a lot about Rome because we have historical records. And it's crystal clear that it's the escalating cost of the state apparatus, of the Roman legions, which led to the collapse of the Roman Empire, and nothing else. In our formulaic terms, it's the contradiction between the state and its cost, that is the army and the police, in this case mainly the legions, and the profit margins. Okay, that handles the general crisis of the stage of slavery for us pretty well. Now, we're faced with the key question. The next key question is, how is it that the kind of atrocious society that existed at the dawn of civilization in these slave stages was suddenly socially acceptable when mankind had lived for at least 5 million years in a state of total egalitarian relations and altruistic in human interactions? That was a question that had to be answered. That was another reason Karl Marx spent the last 7 years of his life trying to figure it out. What propelled him in that direction was the betrayal of the German Social Democrats as soon as they got into power. Of all of the high-minded objectives of what people had considered to be socialist ideals in Europe, what had happened in Germany with the German Social Democratic Party, as soon as the SDP leaders got what they wanted in terms of higher wages for the workers, and relatively legal conditions for some of the unions and the right to vote and a few other things, is they jumped right on the imperialist bandwagon. They were right in with the whole idea of conquering Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The Americans, of course, had cut Latin America out for themselves, but in Europe, for the Germans, it was Africa and Asia. The German Social Democratic Party went right along with it until their ultimate betrayal in July and August of 1914, when they jumped into the imperialist war on the side of the German Kaiser. And it was that war which, of course, sent Lenin to the library in Bern to try and figure out how the hell had it happened, because that wasn't supposed to happen. Now, we're not going to go into the socialist phase at this particular moment, but I wanted you to understand why Marx all of a sudden went back in the last 7 years of his life and spent those years trying to figure out how things had gone so wrong that mankind had suddenly become the kind of avaricious, animal-like creatures that we know existed in ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, ancient China, and so on, as with the dawn of so-called civilization, that is, with the dawn of slavery. He satisfied himself, as I said before, by pointing out that the ethnological record, particularly that shown by Lewis Henry Morgan, the American lawyer and first anthropologist, founder of American anthropology, in his book Ancient Society. Now, when you read through Marx's ethnological notebooks, you can see, because he says very clearly, that the answer to that question lies in the chiefdoms. Somehow, mankind's mindset was changed during these chiefdoms, and he speculates a little bit about it based upon the paragraphs not only of Morgan, but of other men of that time like Tyler and Maine. He was familiar with all of the people we call early anthropological writers, and it becomes clear then. However, he died in 1883 before he was able to finish his work, and it sat more or less unfinished for a long time. Frederick Engels, he asked on his deathbed to finish the last 2 volumes of Capital, which he did, and to summarize his notes on Lewis Henry Morgan and bring it into the Marxist, what we call the Marxist classical pantheon of books. In fact, Engels did his very best to master Ancient Society and Karl Marx notes. In fact, he even got on a boat. He went to the United States. He went while he was on the train from Washington, D.C. to New York. Morgan died. Morgan lived in New York. Anyway, so he was unable to interview the man and ask any questions that he might have had. We'll never know what he might have asked had he gone there. He did finally produce the book that Marx asked him to produce in 1888, called The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. At any rate, at that point, things pretty well stopped. After the Bolshevik Revolution had solidified to the degree that he could, by 1918, Lenin sent a man named David Ryazanov to Berlin to get out of the vaults of the Second International everything that they were holding in Karl Marx's original manuscripts, which included those ethnological notebooks. It also included geological notebooks of about the same size, which have not yet been translated into English as far as I know. At any rate, Ryazanov concluded that Marx must have gone senile in the last part of his life to waste so much time on things. In other words, he never understood the significance of what Marx was working on. What Ryazanov did do was to bribe every German Social Democrat that he had to bribe in order to get all of that material back to Moscow, where it became the centerpiece of the Marx-Engels Institute, and Ryazanov chaired that for the rest of his life. Now, to get back to our basic topic here of the servitude epic, when we get to the next set of lectures, we're going to talk about primitive communism. The overwhelming 5 million years of human history is spent in a period of time where everybody shared everything and everybody had exactly the same stuff. Now, how did that change to a point where some people figure that they're going to get everything they can for themselves, no matter what it costs the others? There's one thing I want to conclude with here, and that is the central contradiction in the era of the servitude epoch is the idea of maximizing production no matter what the ramifications of that maximizing may be, and within the framework of a class structure. But for 5 million years preceding that, except for this very short 1,000 to 2,000 year period of chiefdoms, the main contradiction in society was between the potential to create much more than you actually produce. Both the hunting and gathering bands and the tribal agriculturalists always had the capability of producing far more than they did. So we have to ask the question and answer it as to why that contradiction of being able to produce far more than you actually do produce transformed into the contradiction of the servitude epoch. These were things that Karl Marx said himself. We didn't have the information in those days for him to complete his work. He didn't have the time. But we have had both the time and the work of many anthropologists of all types, especially archaeologists, since then, and we have that record. We can answer those questions. Anthropology, by the way, has 4 subdivisions: archaeology, cultural anthropology, physical anthropology, and linguistics. It takes all 4 of those disciplines working together to come up with answers to all of these particular questions. So that concludes lecture number 1, an introduction to the ABCs of communism and some of the central features of capitalism and slavery.